In the last lecture, we started on creating decorators, which we will use as a validator. And we created required decorator, we created min length decorator, and we created positive number decorator, which we want to use as a validator to validate the properties of a class, the value which we are going to assign to the properties of a class. So if you go to VS Code, you will see that here we have created three decorators: required, min length, and positive number. And inside these decorators, what we are doing is, here we have a constant called validate object, which is currently assigned with an empty object. Okay. Now inside these validators, what we are doing, and also the type of this validate object is iValidator. That means this validate object should have a property, and this property will be a class name which will be assigned with an object, and in that object we will have properties with the class property name, which will store an array of string, and in that array of string we will have the validators which we are using on that property. So in these functions, what we are doing is, in these decorator functions, what we are doing is, we are creating that class name property. To that we are assigning an object, and inside that we are creating a property with the class property name, and to that we are assigning an array, and inside that array we will have the string values for which we have added a validator. So for example, here we have this user class, and we are passing this user class to this validate function, and here we are creating an instance of this user class. We are creating two instances of that user class. So every time an instance will be created, this required function and this min length function will be called on this username. And on this age also, let's add positive number decorator. So for this age property, this positive number decorator will be called. And what it will do is, behind the scenes, it will create properties for this validate object. So the object is already there, but it is an empty object. Inside this object, every time we are going to create a new instance, it is going to add some properties. So when we are creating this u2 variable, at that time, this validate object will look something like this. And here let me comment this, because this validate object is a constant. So in this validate object, we will have a property with the class name. So in this case, the class name is user. So we will have a property with that class name, which will again be assigned with an object. And in that object, in this user class, we have two properties: username property and age property. So in this object, we will also have two properties: username, and this property will be assigned with an array. And in that array, we will have two string values, required and min length. Because if you see these functions, what we are doing is, to those properties, we are assigning an array, and in that array, we are specifying this value required, min length, and positive number. So for whichever property we are calling that validator, in this object, a property will be created with that property name, and there we will have those values. So for the username, we will have required and we will have min length. Okay. Then we will also have a property called age, because in this user class we also have this age property, and this age property is decorated with this positive number decorator. So this property, it will also get assigned with an array, and in that array we will have a string value positive number. All right. So whenever these decorators will be called, we are going to create a property with the class property name, and to that we are going to assign an array, and in that array we are going to have all the validators which we have used on that property. Now here, with this implementation, we have one problem, and the problem is, here we are assigning a new array every time a validator function will get called. So for example, if you see here on this username, we are using two validators, this min length and this required validator. Now we have learned that the validator function gets executed from top to bottom. So in this case, first this validator function will be executed. What it will do is, to this property, to the username property, it is going to assign an array where we will have one string value min length. And after that, this required validator will be called. And in the required validator, again, what will happen is, that same username property will be assigned with a new array. And there we will have this required string element. But here what we want is, since on this username property we are using two validators, in the array we want to have two values, required and min length. Currently what will happen is only the last validator which will get executed, the last decorator which will get executed, that validator's identifier, that means in this case for the required, let's say the identifier is required string. So that will be assigned to that property. The array will have only one element called required. But we also want to keep the previous validator's element, in this case min length. So we need to modify these functions a bit. For now, let me show you how this validate object will look like when we are creating an object of the user class. So inside this validate function, let's go ahead and let's log validate object. If I save the changes, you will see that an object has been logged, and this object will be of type iValidator. In there, we will have a property with the class name. As you can see, we have a property with the class name called user. If I expand that, there we should have two properties. We should have username property and age property. But currently you will see that we have only age property, which is assigned with an array called positive number. So this positive number is the validator which we are using on this age property. Now the question is why we only have age property, why we do not have this username property. That's again because when this positive number decorator will be called, at that time it is going to override this validate object, and there it is only going to create one property, the age property, and the previous properties which we had, it is overridden with this age property and it is assigned with this positive number. So the username property was overridden, and that's why we have only one property which is age. So the first thing which we need to do is we want to keep the previous properties on which we have used the validators. For that, I'm going to use spread operator on the object. So this expression here, this validate object and this part, it is going to return us an object. It is going to return us this user object, the object which we have assigned to this user. Okay, so from that we want to extract all its properties and we want to keep those properties. Okay, and then we want to create the new property with the property name on which we are using that validator. Okay, so let me do this for all of these validators. And now if I save the changes, again, the user object will be logged. But now in that user object, you will see that we have two properties, age and username. So the previous property is also retained here. And that's what we have done using this spread operator. Now, if you see on this username, we are using two validators, this required validator and min length validator. But currently this username only contains the required validator. It does not contain the min length validator. Now why is that? That's again because what is happening is, since these validators, these decorators will be executed from top to bottom, first the min length validator will execute. There to this username property, we are assigning this array where we have one element min length. And then the required validator will execute. And when that validator will be executed, we are overriding the previous value of that property, and to that we are assigning a new array where we have one element called required, and that's why you see that required here and not the min length. But here also we want to keep the previous value, if any, inside this array. So here also we can use spread operator. Now what do we want here? We want to have the previous value of these arrays and we want to keep those previous values, and then we want to add a new value. So to get the previous values, this expression we know it is going to return us the object. In this case, it is going to return us this object. So let me put it here. Okay. And from this object, we want to extract the value which we have inside the property name. So for example, here, let's say the property name is username. So this user, from this user, we want to extract the value of this username property. It is going to return us an array. Okay. We want to use spread operator on that array and we want to extract all its values. Okay, so we want to extract all its elements, and that's why I'm going to write this logic here. So I'm going to extract all the previous elements and then I'm going to add a new element called required here. Now here we might have one problem. So for example, for the first time when we are using this min length on this user property. When this min length will be called, at that time this validate object, because we are calling this min length for the first time, at that time this validate object is an empty object, as you can see here. So on that object we will not have any user property. So at that time this expression here, it will return us undefined, and on that undefined here we are trying to access the property name. So for example, this property name will be user. In that case, we are trying to access the username property on that undefined value. So it will throw us an error. So here we are going to use this question mark, and then we will use dot. So if this expression is going to return undefined, we are not going to evaluate any further. But if it is not undefined, then we want to access the property name. Let's do the same thing here as well. Okay, and here as well. Now let's remove this empty array from here. Okay, now let's save the changes and let's see what we get. All right, so here we have an error, and here it says intermediate value is not iterable. Basically, this expression here for the first time when we are calling min length, as I mentioned, this validate object will be an empty object. There we will not have any property. So this expression here is going to return us undefined. And on that undefined, we are trying to use this spread operator. And that's why we have that error. So here we need to think of another way. So what we will do is, let me write an if statement here, and there let's check if this validate object and this part, if it is a falsy value, and let me write it outside of this object. Okay, so if this value is undefined, then we don't want to do anything. But if it is not undefined, that means if it is a truthy value, in that case, let me create a variable here. Let me call it maybe previous values, previous elements. To that, let's assign an empty array, and here let's set its type as array of strings. Okay, and here we will say previous elements equals, I'll use this expression, and then I'll use the property name, so prop name here. Okay, now instead of using the spread operator like this, we are going to use the spread operator on this previous EL. All right, let me do the same thing in min length. Okay, and again here, instead of using this expression, we are going to use previous element variable. Let me do the same thing for positive number as well. All right, with this, let's save the changes and let's see if we have any error. We still have the error, and we have error at line number 202. So here, let me write console.log statement, and let's log previous elements. If I save the changes, something is wrong here. So this previous element is also not getting logged. That's because again here we are missing that question mark and dot, because as I said, if this value will be undefined, and initially it will be undefined because initially the validate object is an empty object, and on that we are trying to access a property. That's why we are having this error. Let's fix it in all the three places. Let's save the changes now. And here it says previous element is not iterable at line 207. That's because if you see, you have specified the previous element as an array of string, but this expression here, if it is undefined, then it is going to return undefined, which will be assigned to this previous element. So what we will do is we will check if this previous element, basically if this expression is not undefined, then we want to return. So now we don't need this expression here. In that case, we want to return the value stored in this prop name property, else we will return an empty array, something like this. So again, let me copy this expression and let me replace it at other places. Let's save the changes now. And now you will see. So we are logging this previous element. somewhere here. So at this line, the previous element is an empty array. Now here, let me expand this user object. And still I can see that the username only contains the required field. It does not contain the min length, but it should also contain min length. So there is something wrong with our logic. And the problem is here we are using not operator and we don't need to do that. Basically, we want to check if this value is a truthy value. If it is not undefined, then we want to assign this previous element with the property value. Okay, and there we will also check if that property name already exists. If it does not exist, then we don't want to get its value. So here we will also check this condition. Okay, so if this property exists, then only we want to get the value stored in that property. Otherwise, we will assign an empty array to it. Okay, let's do the same thing at other places. So from here also I will remove this not operator, and here we will check if that property exists. And finally, let's do that for this also. Let me save the changes and let's verify it once. So no errors. And now we have the proper result. So now username contains both min length and required, and age contains positive number. So now our decorator functions are working as expected. So now everything is fine for the decorator functions. Now let's go ahead and let's start implementing our validate object. So I'm going to remove these two lines from here. And the first thing which we are going to do is we are going to check for which class we are going to do the validation. So here I'm going to create a variable. I'll call it validate class. So basically for which class we are doing the validation, and that we are going to get using validate object, because by the time we are going to call this validate function, by that time this validate object, it will not be an empty object. By that time, this validate object will have a property with the class name for which we are doing the validation. And in that class name property, we will have another property with the property name assigned with an array. Okay, so from this validate object, we want to get that class name. For that, we are going to use the object which we are going to receive here for this validate function. And from that object, we will get the constructor. So this object.constructor, it will return us the constructor function, basically this class. So as we have learned, classes behind the scenes uses function constructor, right? So this object.constructor is going to return us this class. We want to access the name of that class. So for that, we are going to use the name property on that. So in this example, where we are passing an instance of this user class to this validate function, there we are going to have an object like this. So this validate object will be an object like this, where we will have a user property. So we are accessing this user property using this syntax. Now, if we are not using any validator inside the class, so for example, inside this user class, currently we are using these three validators. But if we remove these validators like this, in that case, this user property on this validate object will never get created. Why? Because we are adding this property inside our decorator functions, inside our validator functions. So if we are not using any validator in the class, that means no validator function will be called. And that also means that this validate object will going to be empty. We are not going to create any property inside this validate object, because we are creating properties for this validate object inside the validator functions. But since we are not using any validator in the class, that means no properties will be created for that validate object. That means this line here, it will return us undefined, right? So if that line returns undefined, that means in the class we are not using any validator, and that also means that we don't need to perform any validation for the properties of that class. So here we will check if this validate class, if it is a falsy value, so I'm going to use not before that. In that case, we will simply return from here. We will return true. That means we don't need to perform any validation, and whatever value has been assigned for that class property, that is a valid value. But if this validate class returns us a class, a property, for example, in this case, it is going to return us this user property. It is going to return us an object which is assigned to this user property. So this object is not undefined or null. That means this validate class, it will be a truthy value. And in that case, we need to perform the validation. Now, how are we going to perform the validation? So we know that first of all, we are going to have a property with the class name. Okay, let me show it here. So we know that we are going to have a property with the class name that will be assigned with an object. In that object, we are going to have some properties. Okay, so first we will loop over each of these properties. Then for each of these properties, we are assigning it with an array. So we are going to loop over the elements of that array for each property. And we are going to check what are the validators we are using on each of the property. And based on that, we are going to return true or false from this validate function. So what we are going to do here is I'm going to create a variable here. I'll call it is valid. Initially, let me assign it with the value true. Now let's write a for in loop. So using this for in loop, we want to loop over each property of this user object. Okay. So for that, we are going to use for in loop. Let me create a variable. I'll call it prop in, and we want to loop over this validate class. So this validate class, it is going to return us the object assigned to the user property in this example. So it is going to return us this object. So we want to loop over each property of that object. For that, we are using for in loop here. And then each property is going to be assigned with an array. So we also want to loop over each element of that array. For that, I'm going to use for of loop. So here, let me create a variable. Let me call it as element of, and to get the values assigned to these properties, we are going to use validate class, and to that we are going to pass the property name. So that property name we are going to receive from this prop variable. So this expression here, it is going to return us the value assigned to that property. So if the prop is username, in that case this validate class of prop, it is going to return us the value assigned to this username. That means this array. And if the prop is age, in that case that expression will return us this array. Okay, now what do we want to do inside this for of loop? Here we are going to write a switch statement. And in the switch statement, we are going to check what is the element value. So the element value will be required, min length, positive number, etc. So the validators which we have created. So currently we have only three validators. So I'm going to write three cases. The first case will be required. Okay, the second case will be min length, and the third case will be positive number. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's implement the logic for these cases. So what we want is we want to set this is valid. In case of required validator, we want to set this is valid to true if the string value which we are assigning to a property, if it is not empty string, undefined or null. If it is a proper string value, then we want to set this is valid to true. Now to get the value which we have assigned to that property, we are going to have this object which we are receiving as a parameter for this validate function. On this object, if we use that property name, and where are we getting the property name? In this prop variable. This is going to return us the value which is assigned to that property. So if that value is null, undefined, or empty string, that means those values are falsy values. So this expression here, it will give us a falsy value, right? And we can convert that falsy value to true using this not operator. So if this expression returns as a falsy value, that means empty string, null or undefined. When we are using this not operator on that, that falsy value will be converted to true, and we are going to convert it back to false by using to not operator. So now if this value is a falsy value, using this to not operator, we are converting it to false. But if this value is a truthy value, and this value will be a truthy value when we have specified a proper string value to it, if that string value is not empty string, null or undefined. In that case, this expression will return us a proper string value which will be a truthy value, and using these to not operators we are converting it to true. Okay, so true will be assigned to this is valid. But before assigning true to this is valid, we also want to check what was the previous value of this is valid. So for example, When we are using these two validators on this username, if any one of these validation fails, we need to return false from this validate function. So for example, let's say this username is a required field. So let's say the user has entered a proper string value for this username, for example, me. But we have entered a value, so this required will return true. This validation has passed, but min length will fail because we have only two characters in that value, and the minimum length for this username should be 3. So required validation has passed, but min length validation has failed. So overall validation on this username should be failed, right? If any one of the validation fails, that means this username does not contain a valid value. So the validation should fail. That's why here we also need to check the previous value which was assigned to this is valid. So we are going to use is valid and we are going to combine it with the new value. So if any one of these returns false, then false will be assigned to this is valid. Only when both of these returns true, then only true will be assigned to this is valid. And then we will break from here. Let's do the same thing for min length. So for the min length, currently what I'm going to do is I'm going to hard code the value. So let's remove these two not operators. So this expression, it is going to return us the value which we have assigned to the property. We are going to check the length of that value. And we are going to check if this length is greater than equal to 3. So the minimum length should be 3, right? So if it is greater than equal to 3, then only from here we are going to return true. We are going to check that with the previous value. And if both of them returns true, then only true will be assigned to this is valid. And we will break from there. And here I'm hard coding the length, but we can think of some other way where we can pass the value for the length also. But for now, let's keep it like this. And finally, let's also do the validation for positive number. And for the positive number, we are going to check if the value is greater than 0. And here it should not be length, because here for this expression, we are going to receive a integer value and we are checking if that value is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, then we are going to return true, otherwise we will return false. And here, let's say if the user has entered some string value for the number, we will also convert it to number first. Okay, so that's why I'm using this plus operator, so that we convert the value to number first and then let's do the comparison. And finally, I'm not going to add any default case here. And finally, let's return is valid from this function. Okay, let's save the changes. And now let's quickly test it. So here we are passing u1. So you see, and let me also remove this console.log statement. So where do we have that console.log statement? We have it here. Let's remove it. Okay, so when we are passing u1, this u1 object which we have created here, we are providing a valid value for username and age. So that's why we don't have any errors here and the user has been created successfully. So this else part has been executed. But for u2, we are passing an empty string and the age is also a negative value. So let's go ahead and let's pass u2 here. And if I save the changes, we should get this alert window invalid input. As you can see, if I pass, let's say some string value, but if I pass only 2 characters and if I save the changes, we should still get invalid input because now the min length validator has failed. Now, if I specify a proper value, let's say Mary, but if I pass a negative age, in this case also, this validation should fail because we are passing a negative age value. But now let's pass a proper age. If I save the changes, now we don't have any issues and the user has been created successfully. Now, if I pass empty string for the username, but a proper age, we should get an error, invalid input, as you can see. And if I pass only 2 characters for the username, which is less than 3, and if I save the changes, we should still get invalid input. So all the use cases are working as expected. And in this way, we have used decorators to implement the validators. But in real world projects, we are not going to create validators by our own. We might be using some third party library for validation, and we will not have to create any validator by our own, any custom validator. We need to create custom validators in very rare cases where some third-party library which we are using for validation does not contain a specific validator which we might need in our scenario. So in that case, we will have to create a custom validator. Otherwise, most of the time, we use validators from a third-party library, and those libraries provide almost all of the validators. But anyway, I just wanted to show you how we can use Decorator to implement our own validators. And here we have understood it with a simple example. So this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions related to decorators or any other topic in TypeScript, then feel free to ask it. This is all from this lecture. Thank you for listening and have a great day.